She sat at the dinner table while her husband slid a pen toward her and told her to write an apology letter to his mistress. For existing, no one stopped him. She folded the paper slowly, then stood and placed the envelope in front of him. The air shifted. Power had just changed hands. Nobody paid attention to Afia the night everything changed. And that was exactly the way she needed it. She had arrived at Miss Loretta's house the same way she always did. Early, carrying something, asking if anyone needed help before she even took off her coat. She had brought sweet potato pie, the kind with the brown sugar crust that Jelani's brother Marcus liked. She had made it from scratch the evening before, standing alone in her kitchen, humming softly to herself, the way her grandmother used to hum when the world felt heavy. She brought it not because she thought it would buy her warmth. She brought it because that was who she was. A woman who gave even when the room she was giving to was already cold. The house smelled like fried chicken and floor polish. Miss Loretta kept a clean home. That was one thing nobody could take from her. The table was long and set with the good dishes, the white ones with the gold rim that only came out for occasions that mattered. And tonight, apparently, was an occasion that mattered. Jelani had told Afia it was just a family dinner, casual. Come through, eat, leave early. He had said it the way a man says things when he has already decided what the evening will look like and simply needs your body present to complete the picture. Afia had nodded. She had pressed her dress. She had done her hair simply, pinned back, the way she wore it when she wasn't trying to be seen. She had come. She had helped set the table. She had refilled Miss Loretta's water glass without being asked. And then she had sat down in the chair that had been left for her at the far end of the table, not beside Jelani where a wife would sit, but across from him, 3 seats down, separated by aunts and cousins, and a centerpiece arrangement of fake flowers that Miss Loretta had owned since 1987. That was when Afia first noticed Nadia. She had not been told Nadia would be there. She had not been told Nadia had been coming to these dinners for the past 4 months. She had not been told that Miss Loretta called Nadia baby, or that Marcus had already started referring to her by her first name without any explanation being offered or owed. Afia simply looked up from the breadbasket, and there she was, seated right beside Jelani, close enough that their chairs were nearly touching, laughing at something his uncle had just said, with the easy confidence of a woman who knew she belonged exactly where she was sitting. Afia set her fork down gently. She did not make a face. She did not look around the table to see who was watching her reaction. She simply looked at Nadia for one calm moment, then looked back down at her plate, picked her fork back up, and took a small, slow bite of her greens. The dinner moved the way those dinners always move. Loud in the way that only big black family tables can be loud, full of laughter that sometimes covers pain and stories that sometimes are told to distract from the truth, sitting right in the middle of the room. Afia spoke when spoken to. She laughed at the right moments. She got up once to help clear plates because that was what she did. And all the while, Nadia laughed louder, touched Jelani's arm at least 3 times that Afia counted, and caught Afia's eyes once across the table, with a look that was not quite a smile and not quite a challenge, but lived in the dangerous space between the two. Then Jelani stood up. He tapped his glass like a man who had been waiting all evening for this exact moment. Like a man who had rehearsed this. The table settled. Everyone turned toward him, and in the sudden quiet, Afia felt something shift in the room, some pressure drop in the air the way it drops right before a storm decides to announce itself. Jelani looked down the table at his wife. He said that he needed to address something that had been causing tension in his life. He said it calmly, with the tone of a man who believed his composure made him reasonable. He said that Afia had been calling his phone at inappropriate hours. that she had shown up to his workplace without being invited, that she had been making things difficult for someone in his life who did not deserve to be treated that way. He gestured toward Nadia when he said that. Gently, like he was protecting something fragile. Like Nadia was the one who needed shielding at this table. He picked up a pen from the counter behind him. He slid it across the table toward Afia, and he asked her, in front of his mother, his brother, his aunts, his cousins, and the woman he was sleeping with, to write Nadia an apology letter for existing in his life. Those were his words, for existing. The table went quiet in a way that was different from before. This was not the quiet of a room waiting to laugh. This was the quiet of a room that had just watched something happen that it would not fully understand for a long time. Miss Loretta did not say, "Stop." She made a soft sound in the back of her throat that was closer to approval than discomfort, and looked down at her plate with the satisfied expression of a woman watching a plan she had helped design come together cleanly. Marcus shook his head, not at his brother but at Afia, slowly, like she had been the one to cause this. The aunts whispered. The cousins went still. Nadia sat with her hands folded and a small, quiet smile on her face that she was trying to make look like sympathy. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. Afia looked at that pen for a long moment, and then she reached out and picked it up. Her hand was steady. She wrote slowly. No one could see what she wrote. When she finished, she folded the paper once, twice, with the same careful patience she used for everything in her life. Then she reached into her purse, and this was the detail nobody at that table would forget later. She pulled out a plain white envelope, already there. Like she had known. She placed the folded letter inside it. She pressed the seal closed. She set it on the table directly in front of Jelani, not in front of Nadia, in front of Jelani. Then she sat back in her chair, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing. The air shifted, even then, even before anyone understood why. Something in that room changed the moment she put that envelope down, and not a single person there could explain what it was. Nadia glanced at the envelope and then at Jelani. Jelani looked at the envelope and then at Afia, and Afia looked at no one. She simply sat, still and quiet and present, like a woman who had already moved on to the next chapter, while everyone else was still stuck on that page. But to understand what was really inside that envelope, you have to go back. You have to go all the way back to a small house in rural Georgia, where a little girl learned that silence could be the most powerful language in any room. Afia grew up in a place where the roads were still dirt in some parts, and the summers were long and heavy, with the kind of heat that made everything slow down whether you wanted it to or not. She was raised by her grandmother, Nana Celeste, after her parents moved north for work when Afia was 6 years old. They sent money every month. They called on Sundays. They loved her the way people love things they cannot carry with them. But it was Nana Celeste who raised her, Nana Celeste who shaped her, Nana Celeste whose voice still lived inside her, like a second heartbeat. Nana Celeste was not a loud woman. She was not the kind of grandmother who filled rooms with her presence, or demanded to be noticed when she walked in. She was the kind of woman who walked in and the room simply rearranged itself around her without anyone understanding quite why. She had built a small fabric and textile business after losing her husband at 34 years old, with 2 children and $12 in a coffee can under the kitchen sink. She had not cried publicly. She had not asked anyone for help, not because she was too proud, but because she understood that the help she needed could only come from inside herself. She had built. Slowly, quietly, with the kind of focus that people who are not watching tend to miss entirely. She grew that business from a fabric stall at the Saturday market into a proper shop, then into a small wholesale operation that supplied 3 counties. She did it over 20 years. She did it without a business degree or a bank loan or anyone to co-sign anything for her. She did it with patience and intelligence and a deep, steady belief that the woman who controlled her own resources never had to beg for her own dignity. She used to tell Afia, "Sit down here with me, baby, and learn something." She would say it in the evenings when the porch was cool and the lightning bugs were starting and the day had given them both enough to be tired, but not enough to be broken. She would say that the world will underestimate a quiet woman every single time, and every single time that will be the world's mistake. She would say that a woman who builds in silence builds something no one can take from her because no one even knew she was building. And then there was the envelope ritual. Whenever someone wronged Nana Celeste, and people did, the way they wrong quiet women who don't fight back loudly, she never confronted them in heat. She would go inside, sit at her kitchen table, and write everything she felt in a letter. Everything. The hurt and the anger and the truth she had not spoken out loud. She would seal it in a plain white envelope, and she would keep it, not forever, just until the right moment, just until the moment when her words would land with their full weight instead of being drowned out by the noise of someone else's denial. She told Afia, "The woman who controls the envelope controls the room." Afia never forgot that. She carried it with her the way she carried everything important, quietly, close to the center of herself, where no one could reach it unless she chose to hand it over. There was a particular afternoon Afia returned to often in her memory. She was maybe 9 years old, and she had come home from school crying because a girl in her class had made fun of the dress she was wearing, a handmade dress, cotton, pale yellow, that Nana Celeste had sewn herself. Afia had stood in the kitchen doorway with tears running down her face and told her grandmother what happened. Nana Celeste had not rushed to comfort her. She had not said that girl was wrong or that Afia was beautiful or any of the things that feel good to hear in the moment but don't build anything lasting. She had pulled out a chair. She had said, "Sit down here with me." And she had told Afia that the girl who laughed at the dress would never in her life understand the woman who made it. She said that there are two kinds of people in this world, people who see the label on a thing and people who understand what went into making it. "Learn to be the second kind," she said, "and you will never mistake a small person for a large one again." Afia had never forgotten that. She had applied it to people the way Nana Celeste applied it to fabric, looking not at the surface but at the construction, the thread count, the integrity of the seam. She had been brilliant in school, the kind of brilliant that teachers notice early and quietly recommend for things other students don't hear about. She had studied finance and business on a full scholarship, graduated early, and spent the next decade building on the foundation Nana Celeste had laid, expanding the textile business into a holding company that branched into real estate, then energy infrastructure, then international trade. She had done it all through a private company registered under a name that had no visible connection to the woman named Afia, who drove a modest car and wore simple clothes and asked for nothing from nobody, because that was the choice she had made deliberately. She had decided young that she did not want a life built around being known for what she had. She had watched what happened to women who led with their wealth, how men approached them differently, how relationships became transactions, how even friendships started to taste like strategy. She wanted something real. She wanted someone who saw her, just her, not her balance sheets, not her holding company, not the quiet empire her grandmother started and she finished. So she lived small on purpose. That was how she met Jelani. He was charming in the way that men are charming when they still believe they are becoming something. He had ideas and energy and a wide, warm smile, and he talked about his dreams with the kind of conviction that made you want to believe them too. He was ambitious, yes, but back then, the ambition felt like hunger rather than hunger for your specific resources. He had looked at Afia, quiet, composed, wearing no jewelry worth noting, driving a car worth less than his watch. And he had seen a woman he wanted, not a portfolio, a woman. She had loved him for that. Genuinely, completely. She had invested in his career quietly, opening doors he didn't know she was opening, clearing obstacles he didn't know were there. All without telling him, because she didn't want him to feel small, and she didn't want gratitude to replace love. She had poured herself into their life together with the same focused patience she poured into everything. She had trusted him with her softness, while keeping her power somewhere safe. She had cooked for him on Sunday mornings and ironed his shirts on Tuesday nights, and sat across from him at their kitchen table listening to his dreams about his business with the genuine investment of a woman who believed in someone. Not because she needed to perform devotion, because she had chosen him, and when Afia chose something, she chose it fully. And somewhere along the way, she could not tell you exactly when, Jelani started to change. The ambition that had felt like hunger started to feel like resentment. He started to look at Afia's composure as something that excluded him rather than something that held them steady. He started to sit with men who measured their wives by how much noise they made and how much attention they needed, and he started to feel in those conversations like he was missing something, like a man whose wife never needed him was a man who didn't matter. Nadia had appeared in that space, in the gap his own insecurity had carved out, and she had filled it with exactly what it needed: admiration, dependence, the performance of need. What Jelani did not know was that Nadia was not simply in love with him. She had done her research. She had found out, through a mutual business contact, that Afia was connected to money. Not the amount, not the full picture, but enough to make her curious. She had started feeding Jelani stories about his wife. Small ones first, then larger, then ones that he could not unhear once they were inside his head. That Afia looked down on his family, that Afia had been quietly draining their joint account, that Afia's silence was contempt rather than love. She built a false version of Afia in Jelani's mind, brick by brick, until he was living with the woman he loved and seeing the woman Nadia had constructed, and Jelani, who wanted to believe he was the one being wronged because it was easier than examining himself, believed her. Miss Loretta had been easy ground for those seeds to grow in. She had never been fully warm toward Afia. Not from the beginning. She had wanted her son to marry someone louder, someone who would fill her house with more noise and more performance and more of the obvious love languages that she understood. Afia's quietness had always read to Miss Loretta as distance, and so when Nadia arrived, warm and expressive and quick to compliment Miss Loretta's cooking and call her mama before 6 months had passed, Miss Loretta had opened the door willingly and helped furnish the room. Afia had watched all of it. She had not confronted anyone loudly because that was not who she was, but she had watched, and she had understood, and somewhere in the quiet of her home in the evenings, after Jelani fell asleep, she had begun to process what was happening with the same steady clarity she applied to everything else. She was being pushed out of her own life, not violently, not with raised voices or broken dishes, slowly, socially, carefully, the way you push a person out of a room by making everyone in it forget they belong there. 3 things finally broke her open. The first was the legal document. She had been sorting through paperwork on Jelani's desk, not snooping, simply helping, because she managed their household finances as she managed everything, quietly and completely, and she found documents for a property acquisition that listed her as a dependent, not a co-owner, not a partner, a dependent, like she was a child, like she brought nothing to their life except her presence. The second was a phone call she was not supposed to hear. She had come home early from a meeting. one of the many meetings she took from a number that had no name attached to it in Jelani's contacts. And Jelani was on the back porch, his voice low and even, telling someone on the other end that Nadia would be attending the Legacy Gala with him in 2 weeks, as his partner. The third was Miss Loretta's voice through an open window when Afia arrived at her door one Sunday afternoon. She had heard it clearly before she knocked. Miss Loretta telling a friend on the phone that Jelani deserved better, that a man like him needed a woman with warmth and energy, not some quiet woman with no personality who thought she was too good for everybody. Afia had stood on that porch for 45 seconds. Then she had knocked. Then she had gone inside and helped Miss Loretta with her dishes and driven home without saying a single word about what she had heard. That night she drove to the cemetery. She stopped at a gas station on the way and bought a small bottle of water and a pack of tissues and a single yellow flower from the bucket they kept beside the register, the kind of cheap arrangement that nobody buys for special occasions, only for quiet ones. She drove the rest of the way with the window down, the warm night air moving through the car, the radio off. She had nothing to say to Noise that evening. She sat beside Nana Celeste's grave until the sky went from gold to deep purple to black. She didn't talk out loud the way some people do at grave sites. She just sat with her hand flat against the earth, feeling the cool of the ground against her palm, letting the silence do what it always did for her, slow everything down until she could hear herself think clearly again. She placed the yellow flower against the headstone. She stayed until the moths started coming to the grass around her feet, drawn by nothing she could see, the way grief draws things you can't explain. And when she was ready, not when the pain had passed, but when she had sat with it long enough to understand its shape, she stood up, brushed off her knees, walked to her car, and drove home. She opened her laptop. She opened the holding company files. She looked at the numbers for a long time. The real estate holdings, the energy contracts, the international textile operations, the investment portfolios, the trust structures, all of it. The thing she had been quietly building for 20 years, the thing that now sat at a value of $32 billion. She looked at all of it like a woman taking a full inventory of who she actually was before deciding what to do next. Then she called Mr. Okafor. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, because Mr. Okafor had been her attorney for 9 years, and he understood that when Afia called, it was never small. She said 4 words, "It's time." "Do it," he said he understood. They hung up, and Afia closed the laptop and went to sleep. The Legacy Gala was held on a Friday evening at a downtown hotel that took up an entire city block, the kind of building with high ceilings and gold-veined marble floors, and the sort of quiet that is not the absence of noise, but the presence of money. The event had been running for 10 years. It honored Black business leaders, philanthropists, and community builders. It raised money for scholarship funds and development initiatives and arts programs in neighborhoods where those things did not arrive on their own. It was attended by people who had built things and people who wanted to be near people who had built things, which is how most rooms like that tend to work. Jelani had received his honoree invitation 6 weeks prior, a community development award for a housing project that had his name on it, a project he did not know had been partially funded through one of Afia's subsidiary foundations. He had accepted the honor with the smooth confidence of a man who had forgotten, somewhere along the way, how much of what he stood on had been built by hands other than his own. He arrived with Nadia on his arm, wearing a new suit, his smile at full performance. Miss Loretta and Marcus were seated at his table. His colleagues were scattered through the room. Everyone who mattered to him was there to watch him be recognized. Afia arrived alone. She wore deep burgundy, not a color that announced itself, but one that held the room once you saw it. Her hair was down, natural, full. She wore Nana Celeste's bracelet on her left wrist, a simple gold piece, not flashy, not meant to impress anyone. Just a piece of her grandmother she had carried with her since the funeral. She walked in slowly, and the room rearranged itself around her, the way rooms had always rearranged themselves around Nana Celeste, and nobody could explain why, and that was exactly the point. She took her seat, a seat at the front, reserved under her company's name, which none of the people who thought they knew her had ever thought to look up. The ceremony moved through its early awards with the polished ease of events that have run long enough to know their own rhythm. Jelani was near the middle of the program. He went up, accepted his award, thanked his family and his community, said Nadia's name with the comfortable ease of a man who has decided he no longer has anything to hide. From the audience, people clapped. From Afia's table, there was polite, measured quiet. Then the MC returned to the podium, and his voice shifted, became fuller, more ceremonial, as he prepared to honor the evening's highest recognition, the founding partner of the gala's 10-year legacy fund, the entity that had quietly and without fanfare or credit provided the majority of the financial foundation that made every single one of these events possible. The silent hand behind the scholarships, the development projects, the arts programs, the community grants that had been flowing into this city for a decade. He read the company name. The room stirred. A few people in the business world recognized it immediately and leaned toward the people beside them. A presentation rolled on the screens at the front of the ballroom, a brief overview of the company's work. Real estate holdings across 6 states, energy infrastructure contracts, international textile operations, community development investments, and then the number, $32 billion. Jelani's face changed the way faces change when the ground beneath them shifts without warning. Slowly first, then all at once. He looked at the screen. He looked at the number. He looked around the room as people began to process what they were seeing. And then the MC said that the founding partner would be accepting the recognition in person tonight. And he said her name. He said, Afia. The room turned toward her table. She stood slowly. She smoothed her dress. She walked to the front of the room with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who had nowhere to rush to because she had already arrived. And when she reached the podium and turned to face the room, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had built something enormous in the dark and was simply, finally, allowing the lights to come on. She thanked the community. She spoke about her grandmother. She talked about what it meant to build something in silence and let the work speak instead of your voice. She said that the most important thing Nana Celeste had ever taught her was that patience was not the absence of power. It was power in its most disciplined and most devastating form. She did not look at Jelani's table. She did not need to. A few minutes later, as the applause settled, a member of the event staff approached Jelani's table, not a general staff member, one of Afia's people. He set an envelope down in front of Jelani without a word, plain white, sealed, the same envelope from the dinner table, untouched, returned. Jelani looked at it for a long moment. Nadia looked at it. Miss Loretta looked at it. Marcus looked at it. And then Jelani picked it up and opened it with hands that were not quite steady. Inside was not an apology to Nadia. Inside was a legal notice, clean, complete, and already executed. A full dissolution of every financial entanglement between Afia and Jelani. All joint accounts already separated, all shared property already legally clarified. His name removed from every document it had been placed on without her full knowing. And beneath the legal notice, a single handwritten line on plain paper in the careful cursive that Nana Celeste had taught her at a kitchen table in rural Georgia 30 years ago. It read, "I wrote what I felt. just like Nana Celeste taught me. Jelani set the paper down on the table. Nadia leaned over and said something to him, her voice low. Whatever it was, it did not help. His colleagues were already on their phones, connecting the name they had just seen, honored on that screen, to the woman they had watched Jelani marginalize at every professional gathering for the past 2 years. The journalists in the room were already writing notes. The room was rearranging itself around the truth the way rooms do when the truth is finally allowed to take up its full space. Then one of the hotel managers came to the table. He spoke quietly to Jelani with the formal politeness of a man delivering information he did not create. He informed Jelani that 3 of the commercial lease agreements he had believed he co-owned, the ones his business operated from, the ones he had put his name on with confidence, had a silent majority stakeholder that had recently withdrawn its position and declined to renew. The leases would expire within 60 days. There would be no extensions offered. The silent majority stakeholder had been Afia's holding company. Jelani had been operating his business inside buildings he did not own on terms arranged by a woman he had publicly humiliated and he had never known. Nadia did not make a scene. She was not that kind of woman. She simply gathered her things, pressed her lips together, and left the table with the quiet efficiency of a person who has done the math and found that the numbers no longer work in her favor. No goodbye, no explanation, just the soft sound of a chair being pushed back and heels crossing marble, and then nothing. Jelani watched her go. He did not call her back. Miss Loretta sat very still beside Marcus, who had turned to look at Afia's table with an expression that moved through several things: confusion, recognition, and something that might, if you were being generous, have been the beginning of shame. Miss Loretta did not look up for a long time. She had the look of a woman sitting inside the specific kind of quiet that arrives after you realize you have used the wrong measuring stick for a very long time on someone who deserved much better than what you gave them. The weeks after the gala moved the way consequences move, not dramatically, not all in one moment, but steadily, with the inevitability of water finding its level. Jelani's business collapsed with the kind of quiet speed that happens when the foundation has been compromised rather than the surface. Jelani's business collapsed with the kind of quiet speed that happens when the foundation has been compromised rather than the surface. The leases expired. The investors who had been watching the public story of the gala with their own calculations running pulled back from commitments they had been slow to finalize anyway. He made calls he should not have had to make. He asked favors he had not earned the right to ask. He drove past buildings he thought he had a stake in and looked at them from the car the way a man looks at something he once held and has already lost before he fully understood what he had. He reached out to Afia twice, once through Mr. Okafor and once personally from a parked car outside a building he did not know she owned, calling a number that rang 4 times and then went to voicemail in her clear, unhurried voice. She did not call back, not because she was cruel, because she had already said everything she had to say in a sealed envelope on a dinner table and in 4 words on a phone call to an attorney, and in the calm way she had stood at a podium and let the truth speak without raising her voice once. She had nothing left to say to him. Everything that needed saying had been said. Miss Loretta's community center received a letter 3 weeks after the gala. It came from a foundation office, and it was written in the careful, formal language of legal correspondence. It informed the center that its primary anonymous benefactor, the entity that had provided the funding for the building itself, for the after-school programs, for the annual back-to-school drives, for the summer literacy initiatives, for the women's health workshops, for everything, consistently, for 9 years, had formally withdrawn all future support. The letter did not explain why. It did not need to. Miss Loretta sat at her desk in that center for a long time after she read that letter. She was a woman who prided herself on knowing things, on knowing her community, knowing her son, knowing the nature of the people around her. She sat with the letter in her lap and looked around the room she was sitting in, at the walls she had painted, at the children's artwork framed near the window, at the new flooring she had been so proud of when they installed it 3 years ago, at the kitchen where they served hot meals on Wednesdays. And she understood, for the first time and completely, who had made all of this possible, who had been making it possible year after year, silently, faithfully, without ever once using it as a reason to expect different treatment at anyone's table. She had not known. 9 years, the woman she had dismissed and minimized and allowed to be humiliated at her own table, had been quietly, faithfully funding the most important work of Miss Loretta's life, had been holding up the building she stood in, had been paying for the programs she took credit for running, had never said a word about it, had never used it as a reason to be treated differently, had simply given because that was who she was, and had simply stopped when she was no longer able to give to people who had shown her who they were. Afia, through all of this, was somewhere warm. She had a house, not the one she had shared with Jelani, but one she had owned for years, quietly, through one of her subsidiaries without ever telling anyone. A modest house with a garden, the kind of garden her grandmother would have approved of. She had tomatoes coming in along the south fence and something with purple flowers near the porch steps that she was still learning the name of. She spent mornings in that garden the way Nana Celeste used to spend mornings in hers, not rushing anything, not performing contentment for anyone watching, just being present with things that were growing. Some mornings she sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea before the heat came and just listened. She listened to the birds and the distant sound of the neighborhood waking up and the particular quiet of a life that no longer carried anyone else's weight in it. There is a specific kind of peace that only arrives after a long storm, not a peace that has never known pain, but a peace that has walked through pain and come out the other side, with its bones still intact. That was the peace Afia was living in now, and she wore it the way she wore everything, without announcement, without explanation, without needing a single person to validate it. She was lighter than she had been in years, not happy in the way people imagine happiness, not dancing through her kitchen or calling everyone she knew. Just lighter, the way a person feels when they have set down something heavy they had been carrying so long, they stopped noticing how heavy it was. She kept a small wooden box on the porch table. Inside it were envelopes, some old, some new, each one sealed, each one containing a letter she had written to someone who had hurt her at a moment when the heat of the hurt might have made her say something she did not fully mean. Some of those envelopes had eventually been used, the way the one at the dinner table had been used. Others would never be opened by anyone but her. That was the discipline. Not everything warranted a response. Some things you wrote down and sealed away simply to release them from inside yourself, so they could not keep taking up room. She sat at that table one evening as the light was going low and gold over the garden, and she took out a blank piece of paper. She wrote one last letter, not to Jelani, not to Miss Loretta, not to Nadia. She wrote to Nana Celeste. She wrote everything, the dinner table, the pen being slid toward her, the envelope, the gala, the podium, the way the room had looked when the lights came on and the truth took its full space. She wrote it the way she had been taught, carefully and completely, without leaving anything out. When she was done, she folded it. She pressed it against her chest for a moment with both hands, the way you hold something that is both an ending and a beginning, and then she placed it in the wooden box beside the others and closed the lid. The garden was quiet. Somewhere down the road, a child was laughing. The purple flowers by the porch steps were doing what flowers do in the last light, catching it, holding it, giving it back slowly. Afia never needed anyone to believe in her. She just needed them to keep underestimating her long enough for her to finish what she was building. The quietest woman in the room was never the weakest one. She was just the only one patient enough to let the truth speak for itself. She never attacked anyone. She never raised her voice. She never fought for a seat at a table that was never worthy of her. She simply built. And when the time came, she stood up, placed an envelope on that table, and walked away with everything that had always been hers, including her own dignity. The pen he slid toward her that night was never meant to be a weapon, but in her hands, quietly, completely, it became exactly that. If Afia's story moved something in you, if you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have protected you, drop a comment below and tell us. You don't have to explain it, just say I felt that. And if you know someone who is carrying something quietly right now, share this with them. Every day we tell stories about people who were written off and came back in ways nobody saw coming. See you in the next